content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, sensitive topics, and explicit language that may be triggering, offensive, or sensitive subjects to some viewers and listeners. Discretion is advised. The purpose of this podcast is to explore and discuss true crime cases for entertainment and educational purposes only. This podcast does not intend to glorify or sensationalize crime, but rather aims to analyze and understand the complexities of human behavior in the criminal justice system. We encourage listeners to approach this content with empathy, critical thinking, respect for the victims and their families.
Tonight, we're diving into the dark and twisted corridors of an experimental prison system in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Now imagine a facility not to rehabilitate, but to manipulate. And putting the worst of the worst were thrown together under brutal, inhumane conditions. Prisons that seem more like laboratories for suffering rather than a path to justice. Now, my guest had firsthand accounts from a prisoner about these disturbing methods they use and the psychological toll on the prisoners and the ripple effect of these failed experiments on society. Was it science gone rogue, or was these conditions crafted to feed an appetite for punishment over progress? So pour yourself your favorite glass of wine, sit back, and let's uncover some of these hidden truths behind these horrible and torturous experiments. It's time to start the show. Let's hit it. Hi, welcome to another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. I am your host, Winnie Schrader. And tonight we're going to have a real jaw dropper. We're talking about experimental prison systems. Yeah, you heard that right. Prisons where the most violent offenders were crammed together in conditions that didn't just fail to rehabilitate them, but seemed to design to do the exact opposite. Now, picture this: prisoners treated like lab rats, subjected to psychological and physical torture, all under the guise of research. Spoiler alert, it's not pretty. These were more than just prisons, they were living, breathing experiments in cruelty. Now, we'll be unpacking some of these chilling stories of what really went on behind those prison walls and the toll it took on the inmates and even the staff. And the question we all need to ask is what were we trying to accomplish here? And who's really benefiting from all this suffering? Now, I found an author that got firsthand accounts of what was going on behind those prison walls. I have Carla Conti, the author of Chained Birds, a true crime memoir. Now, after 3 years of being in Europe, former journalist Carla Conti just wanted to have a quiet life back in Philly. But when her old friend Scott Powell from high school, he's a lawyer, asked for some help with this brutal prison stabbing case that he had. And she found herself pulled into this dark world of federal prison gangs, abuse, and corruption. Now, Carla agreed to do a tell all book using the prisoners as her source, but things did take a deadly turn. Two prison gangs issued hit orders, putting her, Scott, and their client in danger. Now, Chained Birds is Carla's true crime story about her 10-year fight to help Kevin Saunders, a federal inmate, to rebuild his life. And it's a story of friendship, redemption, and exposing those true horrors of this experimental prison program in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. So I'd like to welcome Carla to the show.
Thanks, Winnie.
Yeah, when I came across your book, I thought it was an interesting take because normally people don't talk about the prisoner side of things, what it's like for them in prison, what's going on, what kind of programs they have. So when you moved back to the States, and it seemed like you kind of got roped into this case. So kind of give us a starting point of how you got involved with your friend Scott and how you progressed through this case to help inmate Kevin Sanders.
Sure. So Scott Powell is my high school friend. And back in 2011, he had been assigned a case, a criminal defendant that he was defending as a public defender.
Okay.
And this defendant, Kevin Sanders, was an inmate at Lewisburg Prison.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a brutal prison stabbing inside a recreational cage. And he was the lone attorney on the case and didn't get outside money for extra help the way another lawyer would have, an investigator and funds to help with the case. So he was hoping to get me involved to write a story about his client because he thought he was being wrongfully prosecuted, and to make a website with the story to try and raise money, kind of like crowdsourcing for this inmate's defendant. So that's how I got involved in the case and met Kevin Sanders. And one thing led to another, and somehow I became part of the defense team because he paid me an entire $1 and sent me a letter. And that made me part of the defense team. And and then I went on this more than 10-year odyssey, finding out about the underbelly of federal prison and what happens with prison gangs and hit orders and corrupt officials. And it was eye-opening and eventually led to my book, Chained Birds.
Okay, yeah, because people know now. It says it was an experimental prison program. What is an experimental prison program? Like, what is involved with that?
Sure. So I'll back up a little bit. At the beginning of my book, in the prologue, I talk about a correctional officer from Atwater Prison in California, and his name was Jose Rivera. And in 2008, Jose was in charge of a unit that had about 100 men. And he was doing a typical regular afternoon count where the inmates go inside their cell, the doors are locked, and everybody is counted. And then, they come out and go about their business. So on a typical day, there were 2 inmates from Guam, one of whom had just arrived the previous night. And the new arrival, had a very violent background, including a suspected murder against a different correctional officer in Guam. And so the new arrival ended up selling with another Guamanian, and they got a hold of some prison wine, which was very commonplace, to make homemade prison wine. And they were just so drunk on prison wine, and they had some contraband shanks that were fashioned out of dishwasher parts that were stolen from the kitchen. And for no reason at all, they attacked the officer, Jose Rivera. One of them held him down while the other stabbed him after chasing through the unit. And it was quite a tragedy. And because of that officer's death, the Bureau of Prisons, they were under a lot of pressure to do something. And so they came up with this experimental prison program to try and bring all the worst inmates from across the federal system, like the 2 that had just killed Officer Rivera, and put them in one location, hoping to make the other prisons safer. And this ended up happening in Lewisburg. And in theory, you can see why maybe somebody came up with the idea. It did not end up working. And what happened in Lewisburg with these violent prisoners, not all of whom actually met the criteria and belonged there, but just ended up getting put there. What happened in Lewisburg just became a travesty because the program was very austere. The inmates were locked down nearly 24/7 in these tiny little cells that were the size of a parking lot, in cells that really were only designed for one inmate, but they were double bunked, and they were allowed out of their cells only 1 hour for recreation 5 days a week and a shower 3 days a week. And that was it. So it was all these violent people on top of one another all the time. And it led to a lot of inmate on inmate stabbings and violence. And that was the situation that Kevin found himself in, because he had been transported there as a new arrival, and he really didn't meet the criteria. He was not one of those violent types that they were trying to, get away from the other prisons to make them safer, but he found himself there and then got involved in all kinds of trouble.
Now, what did Kevin, what was his initial conviction and charge? Like, what did he do? Obviously, it wasn't violent, but why was he sentenced to prison in the first place?
Right. So he was serving a 10-year charge for being a felon in possession of a firearm. He had some drug offenses in California, where he came from, and he was found to be in possession of a sawed-off shotgun. And that was, at the time, one of those sentences that if you were previously convicted, you were going to get 10 years no matter what. And it was, strangely, his father who turned him in to the ATF for having this shotgun, which is kind of a whole mystery in itself. And I try to address it toward the end of the book. And Kevin was so distraught at being turned in by his father that he asked the judge to sentence him as far away from California as possible. So the judge sent him to Pennsylvania, but to a different prison, not Lewisburg, but to one nearby in Allenwood. And he was there for, must be about 4 years, and got involved in one of the prison gangs, because that's typically what happens in federal prison. You kind of line up with your racial gang, not because you really want to, but it's a method of protection. And it's just one of the things that ends up happening. And ironically, he's Caucasian, but he speaks fluent Spanish. So he got basically adopted by a Hispanic gang in this Allenwood, Pennsylvania prison, and grew to be one of the higher ranking people inside that gang. But when you're part of a gang, you have to do what the shot caller or the leader of that gang tells you to do. And the leader of that Hispanic gang wanted Kevin to assault his best friend for some cockamamie scheme so that the leader could get out of segregation. And Kevin refused. And that put him in a very bad place. And he had to be transferred so that he wouldn't be killed by that Hispanic prison gang for not following orders. So he got transferred from that prison to Lewisburg. And that's where another odyssey started for him.
Yeah. Well, what sense does it make to put the most violent criminals all in one place? That's literally like having a huge box of fireworks and throwing a match on it. I mean, come on, that doesn't even make sense. I mean, I understand the prison system. I mean, it's this weird culture. You have your gangs and your cliques and things like that. But yeah, just piling all these violent offenders together and just pack them in like sardines is not a good plan. And yeah, Kevin, if he just had like a gun charge and like drug charge, yeah, it doesn't seem like he would fit the criteria for a violent offender. So your friend Scott Powell, who was his lawyer, so what happened that Scott had to, come into his defense? He did he stab somebody or was he set up for that?
Both of those. No, he was set up for the stabbing. Yes. So
Okay.
once Kevin made his way by transfer to Lewisburg, he fell under the umbrella of the Aryan Brotherhood because he was Caucasian. They didn't seem to mind that he had a previous association with a Hispanic rival gang. So he was part of the Aryan Brotherhood umbrella. And he and his cellmate found themselves in a recreation cage one day. And one of the officers was bringing a third inmate into their cage. And Aryan Brotherhood leadership was calling out of their windows for Kevin and his cellmate to assault this third inmate. And Kevin wanted nothing to do with it. He could tell that this was a bad situation brewing, and he tried to warn the officer. He made back and forth cutting motions under his chin with his flat hand, kind of like, don't do this. And he even said, don't bring this guy in here. I know what's going to happen. But once the third person was put into the cage, Kevin had to participate in this assault, or at least pretend to, so that his cellmate would not turn his knife on Kevin. It's kind of like a kill or be killed, or assault or be assaulted situation. Right. So Kevin's cellmate had a shank and made actual stabbing cuts and motions, and Kevin pretended to, and that's how it appears on the video. And so from that assault, and the third inmate survived. He had a punctured lung and he was hospitalized for a few days, but he did survive. Okay. But that assault charge is what became the case that my friend Scott ended up getting as a public defender.
Okay. Now, when it comes to now with this new assault charge for the stabbing, and Scott being his attorney, like, are they trying to charge him with life in prison without parole, or what's kind of what's going on with this case right now? Is it still going, or did it conclude?
Well, it was a case that wound its way through the court for a couple of years with hearings and pretrial things before the bench, and Kevin's cellmate was also charged, and his cellmate declined to have a trial. He pleaded, and his cellmate got 5 years. And Kevin wanted to tell the truth about what was happening at Lewisburg, because it wasn't just the Aryan Brotherhood that wanted that third inmate assaulted. It was also some correctional officers, one in particular who was quite corrupt and wanted that inmate assaulted also. And the Aryan Brotherhood and the officers were working together, and Kevin wanted to tell the truth on the stand about what was going on. And the jury chose to believe correctional officers because they are predisposed to believe people like police, etc., who they think will never lie on the stand. And that's not exactly true. But Kevin was convicted, and we did try to appeal. We lost the appeal. And so he was sentenced to 7 years, whereas his cellmate only got 5 years. And so I remained his friend and advocate on the outside, and followed him and communicated with him as he served the rest of his time, which ended up being in a few different facilities. And that's when we also hatched the idea that maybe this would be a good true crime book. Actually, Scott was trying to lure me in with that idea from the very beginning. I wasn't so sure I wanted to do it, but over the years, I knew Kevin. He would write me stories, and that was what most of our communication was based on. He was just telling me how it was in prison and giving me an insider's view for the book.
And I actually, looking up this Lewisburg prison, it says that, they did psychological and physical I don't know if they call it therapy. I don't know if they're giving him shock therapy or not, but it was just like, and he also said that there was restraints, like people had to get restrained, lack of medical care. I mean, you could just go down the gamut of the conditions that they were living in. And when you put prisoners, especially violent ones, in horrible conditions, you're not going to have a good outcome. And, it's sad that, he ended up, because it's like you have to be part of a gang, or you have to be part of, like, just to survive a jail in prison. And, I understand why he felt like yeah, you're going to lose either way. So it's just like, oh my gosh. And I can't imagine being in prison for something like that and being around these criminals that aren't at your level and making him feel like such an outsider. So when you were writing the book, and you've dedicated 10 years to this, is that correct?
Well, yes, everything unfolded over a 10-year period. During that time, I felt that I was writing the book, and then things would happen, and I felt that I was not going to write that book. And then some more time would go by, and I thought, oh, okay, I'll write the book. And then I would not write the book. And it wasn't until 2023 when I felt enough time had gone by from some scary things that happened to me personally because of my association with Kevin, that I felt it was safe-ish enough, and the story did need to be told, and there seemed to be an ending. So it all kind of came together for me in 2023, but it did last that long.
Yeah. Well, and when you feel like you're on the right path, I mean, obviously you really feel that he was it's not just his time and everything that he's serving is not just. And you have to put some credibility when you dedicate that much time to something like that. I mean, that's what the Innocent Project is. They dedicate all their time to try, because there's so many people in prison that are innocent. It's ridiculous. And, you had to even have prisoners that committed crimes, but somehow framed somebody else. And, there was a serial killer. Honestly, his last name was like Cells or something like that. But like he admitted to murders that he said the mother's in serving life in prison for the murder that I did. And they never really appealed anything. And it's like, so I'm glad like Innocent Projects are out there and putting this kind of story out there. The book Chained Birds, which is the best thriller 2024. You got the book award finalist. Is that correct? Notable few authors?
Yes, it was named as one of the best thrillers of the year from bestthrillers.com, and made another book list for Independent Book Review. And Literary Titan gave it an award in December. So I was very thrilled to get that recognition pretty much right after it launched. And I'm happy that it gives people information that they wouldn't necessarily seek out. Most people don't want to know what goes on behind prison walls and in these programs. And I call it infotainment. If you entertain people enough and they want to keep turning the page to find out what happens, then they might learn something on the way too.
Yeah. Because like when you have these prisoners and you take, I mean, obviously, if they're guilty, they lose their rights, right? I mean, prison isn't supposed to be comfortable, but there has to be a standard across. You can't have one prison doing shock therapy and restraining prisoners 24 hours a day, and another prison looking like it's, a spa. It's just like, now with this prison program, how long did this prison program go on? And did they see any results of what they were trying to do at all?
Well, yes. As we were working the case, I was learning a lot about what was going on behind the cell door from Kevin, who was my inside source. And a lot of the inmates were starting to get advocates on the outside that would help them file civil lawsuits. And I could read these horrific things in the briefs that were, part of the database for the court system. And it involved restraints, like you said. They had some terrible restraint practices that were purely punitive, even though they weren't supposed to be used for punitive reasons. One of them was 4-pointing. They would take an inmate and put him on a gurney and stretch his arms and his legs out and chain, each limb to the wall and leave them there like that for a long time and not really provide them with bathroom breaks the way they were supposed to. There was an inmate, Sebastian Richardson, who detailed his horrific experience being chained in hard restraints, which was in a different type of position. Where he wasn't able to use the restroom and he had no clothes except these like thin paper type clothing, quote unquote. And the guards would leave the window open and it was February and he was kept like that for weeks. So I would read cases like this and start to really understand what was going on. And the local paper knew about some of it, and they were able to report a little bit on some of the cases that were coming out. But NPR and the Marshall Project got together and came out with a huge expose in October 2016 that talked about Sebastian Richardson and some of these other cases that I had already read about. And that put a lot of pressure on the system. And between that and all the civil lawsuits and additional reports, people were able to get access inside and see what was going on. The Bureau of Prisons shut that program down, but only in the sense that they transferred them all to a different facility in Illinois for the same program in a more updated building. But
Oh my God.
I know. And the whole cycle repeated. That happened in 2018 and in Thompson, Illinois, where the new program was, the violent inmates and the severe lockdowns, all the same, stabbings and inmate on inmate violence happened. And guess who came in to report on it? NPR and the Marshall Project. They did another report. And more lawsuits were filed, and that program was eventually shut down, and there are no more experimental prison programs, which they called the Special Management Unit, the SMU program. There are no more of those in the federal system.
That's good. Well, we got to take a quick break. But when we come back, I kind of want to know what's going on since they shut that program down. What has the prison system done since? Where's Kevin? Like, how is he? What is he experiencing now? And maybe just, some positivity that has come out of your stories and having some of the other inmates, obviously they're starting to voice their opinions. Now, did your friend Scott try to take on their cases as well, or did he just stay with Kevin?
He was only assigned one inmate as a public defender. And that's all he handled. Okay.
Well, we got to take a quick break. I have Carla Conti, who wrote the book Chained Birds, and it's one of the best 2024 best year of a thriller book. So please check it out. I'll have all the links in today's description. Buy the book link, her website, wherever you can find it, along with my socials. So we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back.
For those of you naysayers, I want you to know how much I appreciate how many of you grabbed a hold of my small package after last week's show. It is out and available. You can get both of my books, The Other Side, A Guide to the Paranormal and Ghost Hunting, and my brand new book, Theater of the Mind, Tales from the darkness. Both books are out. One, of course, kind of a how-to ghost hunt book, and the other story book of strange supernatural occurrences all around the world. You can get your hand on my small package by just ordering it right off of my website. You can go right to paranormal60.com, scroll down on the front page there, or go to the shop and scroll down. You'll see our book bundle. And I was so humbled by the fact of how many men put their hands on my small package at the end of last week's show and bought it. It was great. It made me feel loved and wanted. I'm not going to lie.
Okay, and we're back from break, and I alluded that I wanted to see where Kevin is now. Where are things settling since they shut down these programs? So can you give us a little insight of what's happened since they shut those down?
Right. So he finished out the rest of his sentence in Florida maximum security prison.
Okay.
And he was scheduled for release in April of 2021. And that was still when we were experiencing early COVID.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so he was not eligible for any halfway house time. Those programs were all shut down because of COVID. So he did not get that, 12 months or 18 months outside to help him transition into society. And he was basically released with the clothes on his back, a few bucks and a bus ticket. And he had to be sent back to where he came from in California with no support network, no family that was able to help and step in. Scott and I remained his friends and advocates, and we, gave some small monetary support as we were able to, and tried to help him, but it was very long distance because especially with COVID, we had no other means to be able to help him. So he was released in California, and as soon as he got off the bus, he got tangled up in a group of people associated with his first Hispanic gang from that very first Pennsylvania prison. And they wanted to exact some revenge upon him because even though it had been 10 years since he denied the shot caller's wish to assault his friend, they wanted a vendetta against him. And also there had been a wreck cage incident with the shot caller. Kevin found himself in that wreck cage before the one that became the incident that Scott defended him from. And there was an assault in that cage. And so the shot caller really wanted some revenge against him. So as soon as Kevin got off the bus, they were waiting there for him. It's kind of unclear how they knew he would be on the bus and when he would arrive, some conspiracy theories about that. He ended up being in a hotel room, and there was quite a bloody showdown. And there are a couple of different stories about what happened. A lot of blood in the room. And he got picked up by police. And less than a day of freedom, he was back in jail for an incident that happened in this hotel room. And he called me in a panic because he realized his address book was missing. And he felt that this Hispanic gang had gotten his address book with Scott and me in it. And he was very concerned. And he said that he thought the gang wanted revenge so bad that our lives were in danger because they would know that we meant something to him. And here I was, all the way across the country and just not really sure what to do with that information. I said, what do I do? Hire a security detail? I mean, this is not practical. But then I also, I tried to think about it logically. I thought I'm just like a nobody. I'm all the way over here in Pennsylvania. So is Scott. And Scott tried to downplay it for me. But that was one of the final times that I decided I was not going to write that book not just for my own safety, but because I couldn't imagine it would be good for Kevin to have to look over his shoulder once he was eventually released, which he did get out of the state charges for what happened in that hotel room.
Okay.
I didn't want him to have to look over his shoulder, so I wasn't writing the book at that point. But he did leave the prison system eventually, and with no support, again, clothes on his back, he hitched a ride with a friend to a new location. He was very resourceful. He ended up getting a job in painting. He was and is a very talented artist. He had learned tattooing and airbrush design on the fenders of Harleys and muscle cars in his father's auto body shop. So he had a lot of natural talent, and he was able to get some work in that field. And he eventually met someone and started out in a very helpful situation because he had a support network, and he joined a church and was able to realize, the type of life that he had always envisioned. But he also had an addiction background for methamphetamine, and that did reignite for him, and it became a challenge that he could not overcome. So my last communication with him was just a simple phone call, and I thought I would continue hearing from him, and I haven't heard from him in over 2 years.
Okay. So you haven't heard from, is he still alive? Do you know? I mean, you have no idea where he is?
No idea.
Oh. Well, I appreciate you writing a book like this because, people, even though they're prisoners, now he had an addiction problem, but if he didn't have that addiction problem, he was rehabilitated. He did it himself. He decided to start going on the right path, get a job, eventually meet someone, wanted to start a family, like you said, envisioning. He was having the life that he always envisioned himself to have. Unfortunately, addiction is very destructive. But, just shedding light on what these prisoners are going through. Yes, they are part of society that needs to be put away due to what they did. You have to pay for your crimes, but they're still human. You don't have to treat them like caged animals.
Well, you're touching on something that is just the way our society handles imprisonment, and try to compare that to our counterparts in Western Europe, for instance. It's very different. The prison sentences are not nearly as long. Nonviolent drug crimes and things like that do not usually lead to prison sentences, and certainly not for very long in Western Europe. And in Scandinavia in particular, Sweden and Norway and Denmark, they have a different approach than we do. Their focus is on rehabilitation. And here in the US, it is mostly about punishment. Now, there are some standout places, and I'm talking about the federal prison system in particular, because that's what I'm familiar with this book. But, then there are state prisons and county jails, etc. And there are places where they work for rehabilitation more. But our recidivism rate, the rate that our inmates who, once they're released, return to prison, is astronomically high compared to Europe and Scandinavia in particular, because their approach is better. They train people, they set them up for re-entry with programs and funding, and their conditions when they're inside. Yes, they're in prison and they don't have freedom, but it's less austere. They have more normal-ish type of an environment and living, and that all leads to a better and more productive inmate that is released into society.
Mm-hmm.
Here in Philadelphia, one of our suburbs, there is an experimental prison program called Little Scandinavia, and they have modeled this prison on one from Norway. And it's going really well. It's, I think, in its second or third year, and it's a very small unit in part of the regular prison, but the inmates have a little more freedom. They're allowed to cook together. They can congregate a little differently. They can choose when they have their lights out, for instance. Their visiting is a little different, and they're trained in for jobs a little better, a little more differently. And the recidivism rate is like hardly anything, almost zero from that program right now. And it's a great model for what could happen in the rest of the country. And there are some other prisons that are taking notice and trying to model that example. I believe one is in Minnesota. So I think there's hope. I think the conversation happens, that there are better ways to do things. It's cheaper for the American public too. It's
right.
Fewer inmates that come back into the system that we have to keep paying for. So,
and that's the thing. And I honestly, right now our prison system is printing money. I mean, it's a big business. And I think that's why, these prisons, they just want to pack as many people as they can in there and just hope for the best, because the more prisoners they have, the more money they get, the more funding they get, and all this stuff. And it seems like it's just counterproductive. But, talking about Norway, my husband and I, we love to watch TV. It's one of the things we do together. And we watched the show Lilyhammer. Now, if you haven't seen the show Lilyhammer, it's starring Stephen Van Zandt from Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. He basically plays the same character as he did in The Sopranos, but he gets relocated under the witness protection program, and he goes to Lillehammer, Norway. And they actually showcase it. When you become a citizen of Norway, they help you get inducted into society. They help you find a job. They help you learn skill sets. And they did showcase some of the prison life there. And it's the same exact thing they do. They just have to go to their own quarters at night. They teach these prisoners skills: planting, cooking, painting. You're basically rewiring their life. And that's what we need to do with a lot of our prisoners, because there's prisoners in there that are sitting there for 20 years for pot. That doesn't even make sense. And, I know there are some, people that cannot be rehabilitated. They're just a bad apple. And there's nothing we can do. But I think there's a lot of people in prison that could definitely be rehabilitated and actually have a good life instead of being, kept up behind bars and wasting away. So that's why that's why this book caught my eye, because Chained Birds, it's a true crime story of Carla's 10-year journey to advocate for federal inmate Kevin Sanders and help him re-enter society after prison. So thank you so much, Carla. This was very insightful. Now, do you have a website or anything that people can check out your works and anything else you have going on?
Sure. My website is carlajeanconti.com, and I'm on social media at the same handle, at Carla Jean Conti.
Perfect. And I'll have all those links along with the book in today's description. Well, thank you so much, Carla, and I hope to see you guys all next week.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. And until our next case, my armchair detectives, stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay aware. I'll see you right here next week on Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot.